Welcome to Levels of Courts. So, in our previous installments, we've discussed the would-be appointment of Justice Kavanaugh. We've discussed the Supreme Court and the controversies associated with the Supreme Court. Now let us look at the levels of courts in this nation so that we can examine questions just like, basically, what else is going on in this legal system within the country. So, we'll do now. I want you to write down, why might there be two different levels of courts? And provide at least two reasons why you think there might be different levels of courts. Okay? Let's move on. So this is a diagram showcasing the various levels of courts. So you'll see in the middle here, we have the local trial courts. Above them, you have the state appeals court, and then the highest state appeals court, which may also be the U.S. Court of Federal Appeals. Then you have U.S. federal district courts. Now notice, both the state appeals and the federal district courts will both appeal to federal court appeals. Now the state courts, the federal courts, as well as the special courts, such as the Court of Military Appeals, the Court of Claims, and the Court of International Trade, all can appeal to the Supreme Court. There is nowhere else to appeal once you've hit the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the nation. So that is as high as your case will go if it gets heard by the Supreme Court. It should be noted, the Supreme Court tries only a very small number of cases a year, and so as a result of this, most legal action occurring in this country is occurring in one of these lesser courts. The U.S., whether it's in the Court of Appeals, the federal district courts, local trial courts, or the Court of Military, or military courts, claims courts, Court of International Trade. So let's look at some of these in closer detail. So the state courts. So the first thing to know about state courts is that you have town, city, and county jurisdiction. And these include things like family court. So family court deals with issues such as child custody, in divorce cases, child protective services hearings, events like that tend to be decided in family court. Criminal court, names is fairly self-explanatory, but it deals with local criminal cases. And again, these can range anywhere from small things like loitering charges and public littering charges, all the way up to assault, sexual assault, battery, in some cities, even a homicide case. In fact, many homicide cases, in fact, are tried in local county trial courts. So, there's that. Then you have traffic court. Traffic court is pretty much as it sounds. It is a court or a section of the court reserved exclusively for resolving traffic-based offenses. Speeding tickets, DWI, drunk while under the influence, drunk driving, drugged up driving, lack of insurance, offenses of that nature. Then you have small claims court, which is a civil court where individuals may sue each other for settlements in a cash amount under $10,000. Such things are handled in small claims court. So, your dog dug up your neighbor's bushes, and now your neighbor is suing you for the value of those bushes. He would probably bring you to small claims court. That would be the kind of thing that might get tried in a small claims court. So then we have the federal court. Now, federal courts exist to try two things. Trials for federal offenses and trials for interstate crimes. So federal offenses are crimes that specifically violate federal laws. not areas that are shared laws between the fed and the state. So a good example of federal offenses. Now, federal offenses can include serious stuff like terrorism, but it can also include things that we would consider less violent or less serious, like copyright infringement. So if you've ever watched pirated video or pirated music, most people have, but nonetheless, doing something like that could technically be a federal offense. Counterfeiting is another good example of a federal offense. Then you have interstate crime. So that means crimes that occur across multiple states. So certain serial killers, sex trafficking or other human trafficking violations are examples of federal crimes because they involve criminal activity occurring across state lines. Once criminal activity crosses state lines, the federal government can get involved. Then we have appeals courts. So both the federal and the state government have appeals court. And what an appeals court is that if someone is convicted of a crime and they believe their conviction to be invalid, to not be a rightful conviction, they may request a retrial in the Court of Appeals. So there must be a reason for appeal. So it can't just be someone who's upset that they got convicted. A reason that might make a conviction invalid could be a forced or coerced confession. They were taken in for questioning and the police beat them until they said they did it. Or coerced. The police threatened to deport their relative unless they agreed to confess to the crime, or something like that. It can also include cases where improper procedure was followed, so the police collected evidence without a search warrant, something like that. That would then be grounds for an appeal. And so what they're doing is the upper court is deciding whether or not that is a reason to retry the case, or to even throw the entire case out. So if, for example, a case depended entirely on a confession, it may well be the case if that confession is ruled not to be valid evidence, it could potentially result in the individual being released from prison and the government dropping the charges. So, in addition to the courts already discussed, there are other types of courts. So you have the Court of Claims. And the Court of Claims is when the U.S. government is sued. So that's when an individual chooses to bring a lawsuit against the United States government. Military court. So the military court covers cases of military misconduct. Now that can include conventional crimes that occur within a military setting. So, for example, there were several cases of soldiers tried for sexual assault of male soldiers assaulting female soldiers while they were both stationed over in Afghanistan. That still was tried by the Military Court of Appeals. But it also could include very specific military types of crimes, like desertion, which is fleeing the battlefield during a time of war, espionage, spying on the country, or war crimes. So, for example, when the Nazis were tried at Nuremberg or Dachau, those were military tribunals. So those were under the jurisdiction of military court. And then you have the Court of International Trade, which is suits involving customs enforcement. So, in other words, people who want to bring certain goods into or out of the country, if they feel that customs is being unfair or unlawful in what they're not allowing in, they could bring a lawsuit in the Court of International Trade. And that brings us back to the Supreme Court. It's the highest court in the U.S. All of these aforementioned courts can appeal to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court will only try cases of a constitutional nature. So it's entirely possible for someone to start off in local trial court, file an appeal with the state appellate court, file an appeal with a federal appellate court, try to file an appeal with the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court just simply says, no, we're going to defer to the ruling of the lower courts. Now, the Supreme Court is made up of 9 justices who serve for life and are appointed by the president. It's they nominated the president, but they're not. They're appointed in that the president names them, he nominates them, but it is Congress that actually confirms them. So that's a brief breakdown on the court system in this country, in a nutshell. So I hope you all enjoyed that. If you have any questions, please feel free